highlight of my whole theatrical career was in my youth.
Yeah. If you would have known that at the time, it might have changed things.
Might have. Maybe. I enjoyed doing television, though. I did a couple of series, because I was in the Wojak famous series, which is
What
still
was it called?
shown. Wojak.
Wojak, of course. Yes, that was, what was his name? Vernon.
John Vernon
Yeah.
played Wojak, and I played
Yeah.
Arnie Bateman, the Crown Attorney.
Oh, yeah. You're one of those faces you kind of grow up and remember.
And then I had my own series called McQueen. So that, I really liked that. I was an action line reporter.
What's that ring about? When was that? About 72?
That's what it was. 70, 71?
I was a big TV addict then too, so I would have seen all these.
Yeah.
CBC. Real drama.
And then I spent most of the 80s directing television. I always directed for the theatre, and a friend of mine who worked at the CBC said I should really direct television because I handled people so well. So I did a course with Danielle Suissa, which I'm sure you must have heard of if you come from Montreal. No? Very well known.
That's an apartheid city, Montreal. Yeah.
Yes.
English side of the country.
Well, she's a very well known film director
Oh, yes.
in Montreal. And we did four of us did a television show. Randy, I almost had his name, from the West, a guy by the name of Alan Goldstein, Danielle and I. And then I did about 15. Would you like to go and
You're wired up, eh?
get that? Because I'm wired up. Just say whatever it is that I have an interview and I can't talk. All right.
Have you run your bars and your leader and all that?
Yes, I did. I'm ready to go.
Okay, so I'm going to take our question list here. I'd like to talk a bit about your first experiences in the theatrical community, starting particularly with Dark Harvest and The First and the Last. So, could you please tell me about how you got involved with Dark Harvest and who you were with and the story behind that?
Yeah, it's always a bit difficult for me to sort of say, oh, Dark Harvest, because I have to think, Dark Harvest. Well, that was Winnipeg. Now, when was I in Winnipeg? Oh, yeah, I'd been in Winnipeg in the early 40s, but I'd gone to Calgary. I'd gone to Regina, then I'd gone to Calgary. Then I came back to Winnipeg, and I was going to the University of Manitoba. Broadway division, which no longer exists, but in those days was right downtown, right across from the Parliament buildings. It was a bunch of old First World War, no, I lie, Second World War huts and stuff. And we were using it for overflow students. And so I'd come back to Winnipeg, and I was going there, and I met an English professor whose name was George Broderson. Typical English professor. Cigarette always dangling from one corner of the mouth. Ashes all over his cardigans and his sports coat with the sleeves, you know. And he and I became very close. And he really became my first mentor. For some reason, he seemed to think that I had as much talent as I thought I had, which was an immense amount of talent. And so he decided to do this one-act play and entered in the Winnipeg City Drama Festival, I think in 1945. So we did, and I won the Best Actor Award. At the time, I thought it was the beginning of many, many awards that would come my way. Of course, it turned out that's the only award I've ever won, but I didn't know that then. So we did that, and the prize for being the best actor was a scholarship to the Banff School, which was worth the grand sum of $30. It paid the registration fee, and that was all. So my mentor helped me, and I went to Banff, which is where I first met Sidney Risk, which is how one thing always leads you towards another. And worked at the Banff School, met a lot of people, had a great time. Came back to Winnipeg for my second year at the U of M, where we did this play called Dark Harvest, which had been written by a Western writer, Gwen Farris Ringwood was her name, and George liked the play and wanted to do a Canadian play. So we did it, and there was also a part of a very... I was very young looking. I mean, very young looking. When my father would get posted up until the age of 18, I would travel on the train as an under 12 because it saved money, right? Well, that's how young I looked. So I was constantly in those days playing 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds. So Dark Harvest was a farm play, and we were the first production, and it became quite well known because of that. And then I went back to Banff for a second year, where Sidney was beginning to form his company called the Everyman Theatre Company. And George got involved as one of the producers of the Everyman Theatre Company. And the story about this is that George had offered to send me to England to a drama school. And it was all set up. And I was prepared to go, and I was at the Banff School, and Sidney asked me, would I like to do this tour of Western Canada, starting out on the West Coast, touring as far as east as Winnipeg, and back, and there was no way I wasn't going to do that. So I had to turn down George's offer to go to England and go out west to Vancouver, which I'm certainly glad I did. I got to England a few years later, so I did get there.
You've not mentioned Dorothy Somerset. Can you tell me, that was at the Banff School also?
No, Dorothy was not at the Banff School. Dorothy was back in Vancouver, and when we came out to start the Everyman with people like Arthur Hill, who went on to fame as Owen Marshall in television out of California, and Murray Westgate, and Ed McNamara, and Drew Thompson, Lois McLean, and Floyd Kaza. It was a great group of people. But we went right up to Gibson's Landing. Dorothy, I think, was teaching at UBC, and she and Sidney were very close. And she was, again, one of the people behind the whole concept, and I think raising money. But I may have met her once or twice at an opening, but I never really knew her as well as I would have liked to.
You say she liked the concept, and there's the title of the company, Everyman Theatre. What was the concept, and why were you called Everyman Theatre?
I think it came from the play. Is it a play of Ben Jonson? Oh boy, now you're really testing my English background. I think it's Everyman. And of course, every man goes through life and comes up against all the problems and how he deals with them. And so Sidney and I guess Dorothy and George had this idea of calling the theatre Everyman, because it was not only every man and women that were doing it, but it was for everyone. And there hadn't been, of course, any theatre since the days of Chautauqua, before the war. And we were the first. I think, this was 46.
Joy Coghill, can you tell me what her involvement was?
I can, because I know Joy from later years, but Joy wasn't a part of the original company. Joy joined the Everyman. The Everyman went on for a number of years after the first year. But in the meantime, I had gone back to Winnipeg. My father had been posted down to Toronto, and I had left the West and came down east. And I decided that if that was going to be the life of an actor, that whole year, 1946-47, where we made $10 a week and room and board when we made it, which was very seldom, I thought, gee, Ted, maybe you'd better finish your education, just in case you need something to fall back on. So I came down to Toronto and I went to the U of T to major in psychology. And that's where I met Donald and Murray Davis, and that led to the beginnings of the Straw Hat Players and the wonderful 5 years while we were all at university and doing summer theatre up in the Muskokas.
I'm going to jump back to the West Coast in a minute, but while we're in Toronto, could you tell me a little more about the Hart House and the performers that you found that were key to its development?
Yeah, sure. The wonderful thing about, which was fortunate for me, I came down to Toronto in the summer of 47. And of course the war had just ended a year or two before. So there were a lot of vets coming to university. And there were people who were also interested in theatre who had been in the war. People like Bill Hutt and Eric House. And they were also a bit older. So we had this wonderful thing of working with people like Murray Davis, who'd been in the Navy, Bill, who'd been in the Army, Eric in the Air Force, who were older, who had much more experience with life than we had, but were as interested and as involved in wanting to be actors. So it made for a wonderful balance of older and younger, experienced and less experienced people. So people like that made for a great 3 years.
Good education. Yeah. Go ahead, take a sip there. Robert Gill has come up quite a bit, and as a sort of a helmsman for this whole thing. Do you think that's accurate?
Absolutely. First and foremost, I think credit has to go to Donald and Murray Davis. It was their idea. They had, even before I knew them, Murray being the elder, was about to graduate when Donald was going into second year. And they had the year before gone to someplace in New York State and worked with some people in the theater. And they came back with this idea, I think, of wanting to form a company of their own, which they would produce, and with all that that entails, which is a lot of work. And Bob was under contract to the university to produce only the 4 shows a year at university, but by using a pseudonym, he worked with us and directed our first season as well. Again, this is Donald and Murray. So the credit for the Straw Hat Players and the beginning of all that summer theatre up in Muskoka is primarily theirs, but they were smart enough to know how good Bob was, and Bob enjoyed working with all of us enough to want to be involved with it.
Did you first start working with Robert Gill at the Hart House?
I did.
Can you tell me what it was like working there, what the space was like?
I came down from the West, having been on the road a year. I'd played over 120 performances of The Importance of Being Earnest, and a new Canadian play. I have to mention a play by a woman by the name of Elsie Park Gowan from Edmonton. So we had done these two shows. And so I was pretty well convinced that I was hot stuff and ready to take over the University of Toronto Hart House Theatre at the drop of a hat. And the first show that they were doing that year was a play called Winterset. And I waltzed into Bob Gill's office to announce that here I was, having just arrived fresh in the city, and I was prepared to play the leading role. And Mr. Gill pointed out that that was very nice, but the leading role was going to be played by a young actor who was about to graduate, whose name was Don Harron. And if I wanted to be in it, I could play the part of a sailor who had no lines and simply walked across the stage. And I said, I'll take it. So that was my start at Hart House. Actually, I did that first walk across the stage as a sailor with Barb Hamilton. So that was the first time Barbara and I started working together, as well as working with Dawn.
And I think there was a fellow named Eric.
There was a fellow named Eric, yes. Mr. Eric House, I think a dear friend that I had the pleasure of working with for many years. The funniest man, I think, I've ever had the misfortune to be on a stage with, because you never knew what Nick was going to do to you next. And during the 5 years that we were all at the Straw Hat Players up in Muskoka, there was at least one show where Eric would break up Donald Davis and myself so badly that the show would have to stop because we could not continue. And Eric would stand or sit on stage with these big eyes and that sad face, as if to say, what's, right to the audience, of course, what's with these guys? What's wrong with them? And we'd be helpless. He's a marvelous actor, a dear friend.
You didn't know he'd be a lifetime veteran, at the time? But he did. He stuck it out in the theatre all those years.
Oh, I knew. I knew that him, I knew Bill Hutt, I knew all of us, John Howe, who became a very well-known director. There were a large group of us who were absolutely bound and determined that we were going to be professional performers. There wasn't any professional theatre to speak of, but we knew we were going to do it as a living, and we all did, which is extraordinary.
Is it something about the times that made that possible?
Yes.
What is that?
I think it was the aftermath of the war. I think it was the fact of a whole new rebirth of feeling, of wanting to give and take, of being so sick and tired of all the killing and the shootings and horror that had been the Second World War. And there was this feeling of wanting a sunburst of life. I know with all of us, Katie Reed and Charm King and B. Goldberg and all of us, the men and the women, I never remember laughing so much as I did with that group of dedicated. We were serious. I mean, boy, we worked hard and we did good work. We did good plays. They weren't just summer stock plays. But we laughed. We just loved every moment. And we lived together as a group so that we were very close-knit.
I feel it's time to jump back a little bit to the Everyman, because I want to ask something a little more about that. accommodations like up at Gibson's?
As far as I can remember, they were crowded. Again, I think the beginning for me of wanting to be a part of a group. Because that was my first professional job, if you like. And there we were, all of us, strangers, coming together, living together, training together. I know, for instance, that I was, by then, a very Canadian Western boy, and we were going to do the importance of being earnest. And there was I, so that I spent a lot of time with a mouthful of pebbles trying to learn how to enunciate. So that there was this whole feeling of all of us, again, creating something. Again, I think, as part of the aftermath of the war, of wanting that group, the group theatre in New York, all that. It was that kind of feeling. And I just loved it. I don't remember anything about it that was unpleasant. I do remember that of the whole tour, I think I was the only person who didn't lose weight. God knows I didn't have any weight to lose. In those days, I weighed about 120 pounds, soaking wet. But I just loved it. And everybody else, trying to get through that tour was a very hard tour. We started out after our training at Gibson's Landing. We had bought a bus, which we had altered so that we could sleep in it and eat in it. And Sidney, who was very tiny man, very tiny, had the pedals and the brake and the gas, had big things put on them so that he could reach them with this huge wheel that he sat behind, that was going to take us across the country. I had I think, about $200 to my name, which went towards buying one of the tires for the bus. We all climbed in the bus the first day to head for Agassiz or someplace where we were going to play, out in the mountains. We got about halfway there, the bus broke down. We never saw it again. From that day to the end of the tour, 6 months, 7 months later, was the end of that bus. We got to our first date on the Everyman Theatre on the back of an open truck that picked us up, and this is in the mountains, and it had snowed. And I was sitting on the back of this bus, right? So I'm sitting there dangling my feet over the back, and we're driving along, and I'm watching the tire tracks like this far from the edge. Very high drops, very cold. And that's how the Everyman Theatre started. We never saw the bus again. We had a truck that carried our props and scenery because we built a whole set. We had pipes, curtains, so that we could build a whole gray curtain set for the both shows. And the truck lasted quite a while. We started flagging down freight trains so that we could get through the mountains from date to date, and the truck would chunter on ahead. The truck gave up and froze up on us, traveling from Lethbridge to Calgary in January, I think, on a very cold day, while it was going. And that was the last we saw of it. So then we started traveling by train, all the way back across from Calgary to Winnipeg, and then Winnipeg up north through to Saskatoon and to Edmonton. And what we had to do was we'd meet the train, and we'd all arrive with all the scenery, which we would throw into the baggage car. and then run to the coach and get on the train. And we would travel to the next town. When we got to the next town, train wouldn't wait. We would hurdle off the train, run back to the baggage car, throw all the stuff off the baggage car, so the train, then we'd meet the train either that late that night or the next day to go on. Fabulous.
That went on for about 7 months, I think.
Yeah, we did a first tour around BC in the mountain area. And then I think in January we went over the mountains and headed west, all the way to Winnipeg, then all the way back, and then back across. I can still remember coming back across the mountains, coming into, I think it was Trail or Vernon, and beginning to see spring and grass and flowers, because we'd been on the prairies all those months. And as you know, they're cold. And it was so incredible to get back down, heading for Vancouver. It was a great year.
I guess you couldn't do that train ride anymore, probably.
No, I guess not.
Sidney Riska, we mentioned his physical stature. How about what was between his ears there?
He had this dream. He had been an actor, of course, himself, and had taught for a number of years at what they called, I think, the Department of Extension at the University of Alberta, which in those days, I think, was about the only place in the country where you could get any theatrical training. And the Banff School was an offshoot of the Department of Extension, University of Alberta. And Sidney had this dream of wanting to produce a company, an Everyman company that would be something that was Canadian, we did a new Canadian play, something that would do the classics, do new plays, and would be theater, not the flicks. I think the flickers or something he used to call them. Driving ambition to do that. Wonderful guy.
Did he teach you anything professionally?
Yes, I think, he and George were my first sort of professional directors and theater people. I had started in high school in Calgary. I started really acting in high school with a wonderful high school teacher, a man by the name of John Laurie at Crescent Heights Collegiate. And that's where I had begun, but it was George Broderson and then Sidney and the teachers at the Banff School that began to do more for me than just let me get up on stage. And I had an awful lot of energy and bound around from.
Was Banff new, Lincoln new when you went there?
No, I think it had been going a long time, a number of years. There was a guy from Seattle, the Seattle rep, by the name of Burton James, who came up regularly, and he was a great theatrical personality. There was a guy from Salt Lake City, Utah, Joseph Smith, a Mormon, of course, who was there as a director. They had a woman from Calgary, Leona Patterson. So it had been going a long time, but not for very long. I think the whole thing sort of started mid-July and went to about mid-August, something like that.
Okay, so now we're jumping back down to Toronto, where we've already spoken about the Hart House. But as part of the original company and co-founder, could I call you that, of the Straw Hats Players?
Yes, one of the founding members.
Could you reminisce a little bit about your first rehearsals there, per se?
Well, I can and I can't, because I can't remember specific rehearsals. I do remember that as soon as exams finished, I would try to get a job as a waiter or something to make some money so that I could afford. We always rehearsed previous to going up north so that we could work with Bob Gill, and we could also build sets and do all that kind of thing. And we would arrive up in Gravenhurst. Oh, again, the season was much shorter than it is now. So we would, mid-July, mid-August, we had the first year, was the only 4 weeks, so that we would go up around the first, but we would rehearse all of June. So we rehearsed the plays, but I don't remember specific rehearsals. I think simply because I was always rehearsing something, or either a play for the COD, the Canadian Central Ontario Drama League, or the Dominion Drama Festival when we got in that, or the New Play Society when I could get a job with them. Anywhere that I could get into a play, I would try to get into a play.
You clearly had your irons in several fires there, including the Straw Hatters. Did you throw yourself into the Straw Hatters? Did you see it as a put all your energy into
Yes.
the situation?
Yes.
And do you recall opening nights or the first opening night?
I remember the first season because we were doing a melodrama called The Drunkard. And Eric House was playing the villain. I was playing Honest William, was, the guy, the boy next door. Murray played the lead, who got into the clutches of demon alcohol and left his wife, who was played by Charmian King, and his baby daughter, played by somewhat grown-up Arby Lockhart. And we were playing at Minette's Point before we got up to Gravenhurst, and Eric House made his entrance as the villain, sneering his way on the stage, hit a slippery spot, fell down and slid right to the front of the stage where his feet dangled over the edge. And of course, being Eric, he just carried on while the rest of us fell in helpless heaps, and the audience, of course, thought it was part of the show. And so I do remember that. We did everything because we were the stage hands as well as the actors. So if you weren't in the show, you were the stage manager. If you had a smaller role, you were doing the props. So we were constantly, totally involved.
Araby, Barbara Hamilton, Murray, Eric, Opal, Beth, Charmaine. These are all the names.
They were Beth Galanders, Charmian King.
How much did it cost? Actually, do you recall the princely sum that it would cost to attend one of your plays?
I think at the very first, I think it might have been $1. Might have been $1. And in fact, that very first season, I think we held over for 2 nights in Gravenhurst at the end of the season before Eric and I rushed back to Toronto. Oh.
You'll have to hold there. Can I bring you a phone?
Yes, there should be one hiding here
It's right here.
somewhere. That's good. Hello.
Oh yes, you want to drop by? Is that close?
No, it would have taken about an hour to get here. Otherwise, I'd have said, yeah, pop in and present your face. And
We'll be a little over an hour or so, I'd say. Go ahead, please. It's rolling.
You're rolling.
Okay, we were telling an anecdote about, I asked you about the admission prices, and you came back to Eric was heading back.
oh, yes, I was about to tell you that as soon as our season was over up in Muskoka, Eric and I rushed back to Toronto, where we had jobs working in the bingo parlor at the Canadian National Exhibition, because there we would make $75 a week. which was a grand sum of $150, which paid my tuition fees for the year, which shows you how much going to university cost back in those days.
Brian Doherty. Can you tell me? Repeat the name, please, when you answer the question.
Brian Doherty. Brian was a very theatrical figure in the Toronto scene who had gained prominence, and I almost had it, with a show that he had adapted and had been on Broadway for a number of years. It might have been one of the Father Brown mysteries, detective things that he adapted. I'm not quite sure. But he was a well-known Toronto figure, and Donald and Murray knew him and got him involved in helping us to organize the Straw Hat Players, so that first year, Brian was our producer. He later, of course, became even more famous as one of the founding members of the famous now Shaw Festival.
Okay, exactly. As part of the original company, we have that question already. Let's move to the Canadian Repertory Theatre, please. The time you spent must have been pretty challenging, considering the number of titles you did. 32 productions in 33 weeks I have here.
Yes, I had one play off. We did 33 shows that one year that I was at the CRT in Ottawa. And I got one show off, which meant that when we closed on the Saturday night, I didn't have to be back at work until the Monday. So in effect, I got Sunday off, because that would be when they dress rehearsed the next week's show, which I wasn't going to be in. And then they opened it on the Monday, and I was back in order to start rehearsing the next play on the Tuesday.
Was that one of your most ever demanding schedules?
It didn't seem to be a time. When I started with the CRT, and there's a whole long story about that I could bore you with as to how I got the job. I had been working in the famous Spring Thaw in Toronto, which was, for those who may not know, went on for many years. It was a review that was put on by the New Play Society, which was run by Dora Mavor Moore, and Mavor Moore, her son, and very successful. And I had got a job which paid the grand sum of $40 a week, which was a lot of money back in 1950, I think this was, or 51. And at the same time, a group of us had been asked to join the University Women's Alumni Association, who were going to do a production of In Good King Charles's Golden Days, Shaw play, starring John Colicos as Charles II, actors like Ron Hartman from Calgary, myself, William Needles of Stratford fame, all joined, asked to work with the ladies from the Alumni Association. And we entered the CODL, which was the Central Ontario Drama League that you had to be in for, and we won. So we were invited to go to the Dominion Drama Festival, which was being held that year in London, Ontario. And I was playing Sir Isaac Newton, character, putty nose, everything. One of my famous, we were known as the putty nose players back then, because we were always trying to change our look. We played so many roles. So anyway, I went to Dora Mavor Moore to ask her if I could have one night off to go to London. And Dora informed me that I had to make up my mind whether I was going to be an amateur or a professional. And if I was going to be a professional, I certainly didn't get a night off to go and do an amateur production. So I had to quit. I had smartly enough gone to her far enough ahead that I could give the week's notice, which I did. Unfortunately, in the show was William Needles. Bill had just come into Spring Thaw to take over from Mavor. And he said to Dora, well, yes, I'd love to come in and take over from Mavor, but I have to have a night off because I'm in this show that's going to the Dominion Drama Festival finals. And Dora said, fine, we'll get Mavor to come back that night and you can go on. This made me somewhat angry because I was giving up my $40 a week that I desperately needed. So we went and I quit and I came back and I snuck into the theater one night and browbeat my replacement in the show into letting me go on stage in one number we did, which was called Mother Goose, and I played the goose so that I was hidden in a goose's costume. You couldn't see who it was apart from my bow legs sticking out underneath. And I had it arranged with the stage manager to keep Dora out of the theater, which he promised to do but failed to do. And Dora was in watching the number, and I came on and I started into my routine, which was different from what my replacement was doing. And Dora saw this, I'm told. She started running down the aisle towards the stage, realized, of course, she couldn't do anything with the audience there, turned around and started running back. The number ended, which was the end of the first act. The curtain came in. I tore off stage, tore the costume off, dove behind a pile of clothes and hid. Dora came in and lectured everyone, a blue streak, about this unprofessional, incompetent, amateurish behavior of this person. Didn't speak to me for years. Saw me years later in a production of The Devil's Disciple. I was playing Dick Dudgeon and came backstage and grudgingly announced that I seemed to have made quite a bit of progress in the intervening years. Anyway, the reason I tell you that is that when I was doing Good King Charles in London, who should be in the audience that night but Amelia Hall and Bruce Raymond, who were two of the co-founders of the Canadian Repertory Theatre, which was the only professional theatre outside of Troy LeFleur, I think, in Montreal, the one up on the hill, which I forget the name of because
Mountain Playhouse?
The Mountain Playhouse. Thank you. It was the only other one going at that time during the winter. And Millie was at the show, came backstage and saw me and offered me work at the CRT on the spot for the following season, so that the upshot of my having to quit Spring Thaw was that I got a whole year's work out of doing. I never did tell that to Dora. I should have told her that. She would have appreciated that. She would have liked that. So that got me to the CRT, and we started, and it was weekly rep, and the first show we did was Shakespeare, because we had a full week. We didn't have to perform at night, so we had a full 7 days to do Taming of the Shrew, in which I was playing one of the lovers. So we did that, and the second show we did was called Here Comes Mr. Jordan, or Heaven Can Wait. They made films of it. Warren Beatty made a film of it, about a boxer who dies prematurely, and I played the boxer. So that was the second show. The third show was called The Butter and Eggman. It was a Kaufman and Hart Broadway play. This was the third week I couldn't learn the lines. I could not. I was playing at night, rehearsing during the day, and I was playing the producer in The Butter and Eggman. So what I had to do was write my lines all over the stage, in drawers, in cupboards, anywhere. And so I would wander around the stage and open a cupboard and And then I think shut that, head across someplace else and pick up a book. And yes, well, because the hardest thing I found at that point was to get into a system whereby you would do the show at night, go home, work until, say, 2 o'clock in the morning. If you didn't know the lines, forget it. Go to sleep, get up in the morning, go to rehearsal, rehearse the next act, do the show that night, and go home and again work until 2. Once I developed that, then I was able to play week after week after week, learning the lines. It was great training.
Yes, thank you. Arms and the Man, does that play bring up anything?
Well, it does for me, because I played Blunchley, I think a total of 4 times in my career in Arms, the Chocolate Soldier in my career. I did it, oh my goodness, where did I do it? I did it at the Manitoba Theatre Centre, before it was called the Manitoba Theatre Centre, that John Hirsch was running in Winnipeg, although John didn't direct The Arms and the Man that I did. A guy by the name of Desmond Scott, who was an actor still living in Toronto, was at that point John Hirsch's assistant, and working with him and Tom Hendry. And Desmond directed the play, which was also one of the first shows, I think, that was filmed after we had done the stage play. It was filmed for educational television in Manitoba. So I played it there. I played it at the Neptune, of which I am also a founding member, in the early 60s, where I played Blunchley again. I played it at Lindsay in a production, which was the 4th time I had played it, and I directed that production in Lindsay, and I think we did it at the Straw Hats too. I can't remember. I did it 4 times, I know that. So I'm very close to Arms and the Man. I think the funny thing is that I never worked at the Shaw Festival. I was asked once in the mid-60s, when Barry Morse was going to run the company, to go and play Straker again in Men and Superman, which I had played with the Canadian Players. And I couldn't go because I was about to do a television series called Wojek, starring John Vernon, which became quite famous in the country. And so I turned it down. But I think up to that point in Canadian theatre, I had probably played more Shaw than any other actor. I had been in Heartbreak House, Man and Superman, I'd played Straker, I'd played Jack Tanner, I'd played Dick Dudgeon, I'd played Marchbanks, I'd played Chocolate Soldier 4 times, and others. So I was very partial to Mr. Shaw. I've always regretted that I never got a chance to go to Shaw. Actually, I'd still like to go to the Shaw. I'd love to play Caesar with Megan playing Cleopatra. So if you're talking to Chris Newton sometime, you could throw that in his ear.
Although the theatre was a large part of your career in the early 50s, you were also part of a group which included Kate Reid, Donald Davis, Donald Heron, William Hutt, the Davises, Charmaine King, who worked with Andrew Allen at CBC. For those of us who weren't there, could you give me an idea of what it was like there, working with him, what it was like, what the group was like?
The first thing you have to remember is that radio was it in those days. It was the big cross-Canada communication artistic link with Andrew and Essie Young and, another one whose name will come to me, whose brother was a great friend of mine, and I can't think of it, he was married to Kate Reed. Anyway, and radio had actors like Frank Petty, John Draney, thank you. John Draney, the Bradens, Bernie Braden. I mean, it was the place if you could get into it. And getting into it was next to impossible. Don Aaron had become a member of that group, I think fairly early on while he was still at the U of T. Bill Needles had come up from the States during the war, or I guess after, because he'd been in the American Army, I think. And he had done a lot of shows in radio. It was difficult. For me, it was almost impossible. For me to stand in front of a mic with a script and play just to that person there was extremely difficult. Also, in my youth, and still, I was constantly being told that I had a strange voice. People always were saying, like Bob Gill said to me at first, have you got a cold? And another point earlier on, he said, I don't think you'll ever be able to play Shakespeare. So I had this which troubled me somewhat. On stage, I could move and I could dazzle people with my lightness of foot and my bouncing personality. In front of that mic, for me, it was hard. It took me years to get to where I was really comfortable in front of a radio. And when I did, I loved it. I did a series years ago called 24 Sussex Drive. I think we did 39 episodes, which was quite a few, in which I was the first Western Prime Minister of the country. This was before Mr. What's his name from Calgary? No, before long. It's after John. So John had been. Mr. Diefenbaker had been. Yes, I'd forgotten. How could I forget Mr. Diefenbaker? But my wife in the series was of Ukrainian descent. So it was before Mila and before, what is his name from Calgary?
Prime Minister?
Yeah, he was Prime Minister, and Clark, of course. And by then I was really comfortable. In the early days, if I did get one or two lines with Andrew or Essa, I would be in a blue funk, much more nervous than I would ever be on stage. So it was always, for me, incredibly exciting because it was live. And we did things like Ford Radio Theatre in front of an audience. Then I was fine with the mic because there was an audience there. But it was great.
Do you do any of the school's broadcasts?
Yes, a lot of them. Ethne Black. My goodness. Remind me of Ethne, who produced schools. Ethne Black was her name. She produced schools for years. I did a lot of work for her. I also, actually, years later, produced and directed two big productions for radio. One was Othello, which I had directed down at Theatre New Brunswick. And I did it for radio. And Ron Hartman was my Othello, and he won a big award for radio drama that year. And I also did a production of School for Scandal on radio. So I did a bit of directing for radio as well. For years, I called myself an actor who directs. And then my later years, I called myself a director who acts. Now I call myself semi-retired as a euphemism for unemployed actor.
Speaking of Don Heron, who you just mentioned, I have a quote which I have attributed to him. I don't know if it was him or not, but there was a period when a few Brits were coming over, and it looked like taking some work kind of thing, and everyone liked them. But could you explain?
I can tell you what the comment is, but it wasn't Don Heron.
Oh, good. So could you please start with it?
The comment took place in the CBC canteen. We were all sitting around having. I don't know whether I was there that day, but everybody, and this was the television days, and there were a lot of English actors now working, in a lot of very well-known now English, Pat McNee of fame, and directors who were there. And I'm not going to remember his last name, but a Canadian actor, Jerry, a well-known Canadian actor, who was later, unfortunately, killed in New York in a street fight when he was pushed and fell down, hit his head on a curb. Very fine actor. They were all sitting around, and Jerry looked around the room and then said in his loudest projection, "Oh, to be in England, now that England's here." There were a lot of Brits who came over. Joe Shaw, a lot. His wife, Mary Savage. Oh my goodness. Fine actors.
That was the problem, I think. Well, end of tape?